Has anyone here ever heard of a military organization called the Retreads? Okay, good for you. It was a national society of veterans who served honorably in both World War I and World War II. My grandfather was a chaplain of New York County Retread, Hut number 5. When he was 50 years old, he was recalled for World War II. And his first duty station was Camp Maxey, Texas, infantry and Army infantry training camp. And I'm assuming it was a base camp, boot camp, and AIT, Advanced Infantry Training, just from the letters I have. In early 1944, he was transferred to Camp Shanks, New York, which was the largest embarkation station for troops going to the European theater. And I never realized that on troop transports on the ships, there was a military policeman in charge of the Army troops, and that was his duty. And he did 3 crossings, and on his 3rd crossing, they debarked the troops in Antwerp, I believe it was December 10th, 1944, and the empty ship was leaving with just a crew returning to the United States, and it was sunk in the Scheldt estuary. That's a river coming out into the North Sea, north of Antwerp. And fortunately, a British corvette, like a destroyer escort, rescued the full crew. There were no casualties. And that just so happened was like a week before the Battle of the Bulge started. In September of 1937, my grandmother traveled to Europe with her 2 daughters to study. As I studied old documents, I was struck by universal disbelief of general population and national leaders of the gathering war clouds in Europe and the Far East. My mother was 17 and my sister Polly was 15. On Christmas of 1937, the girls were in Brussels, Belgium studying. And if you are familiar with Europe at all, it's not like the United States. It's pretty compact. And anyway, my Aunt Polly was 15. She and some schoolmates went to Berlin for the Christmas holiday. And she wrote in her scrapbook that I have, we went ice skating to marching music. Everybody raised their arm and shouted, Heil Hitler, when they passed. 2 months later, German troops marched into Austria. 3 weeks after that, they annexed the port city of Memel from Lithuania. The world did nothing. My grandmother and Polly returned to the United States in May of 1938. My mother remained in Europe to study music. Excuse me, I'm just kind of getting a cold or getting over one. On March 15th, 1939, the German army invaded Czechoslovakia. The world still did nothing. The summer of 1939, my mother and a Polish school friend, Eva Berbaka, traveled through Europe, and they ended up in Eva's parents' home in southern Carpathians of Poland. My mother met a Polish army officer and fell in love, and they got engaged. And I have the proposal letters this man wrote to my grandmother, my grandparents. And they were dated mid-August. Well, on August 26, 1939, Eva's father put my mother on a train and told her she had to flee Poland. A few days later, on September 1st, Germany invaded Poland from the west. On the 17th of September, the Soviets invaded from the east. By October 6th, the Polish military was crushed, and the world still did nothing. And stick with me on that little phrase. My mother returned to the U.S. the autumn of 1939. She was a very troubled young woman, really all through her life she was. I discovered a 1960 document that hints she and her fiance, Krzysztof Krnapika, may have secretly gotten married in 1939. In 2012, I had a researcher that helped me do some work. We discovered that Krzysztof Krnapika had been captured by the Russian army and murdered along with 22,000 Polish army officers in the Cataian Forest Massacre. And that was the winter of 39, spring 1940. And some of these things I mentioned, most people have never heard of. You know, they're just atrocities. When my my grandmother met a war correspondent named Cecil Brown, and he went on to actually be quite famous. He has a block in Hollywood for being a famous radio commentator and whatnot. He worked with Edward Murrow during World War II. Anyway, he corresponded with my grandmother. And I want to read a short excerpt from a letter that he wrote to her. Smith and Jones are euphemisms for Hitler and Mussolini. And he wrote this on October 24th, 1938, just about 11 months before Poland was invaded. I'm of the opinion that time has passed when Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones can be checked. That time is all with them. England and the world is threatened to punch the weakling in the nose someday, forgetting the all-important fact that meanwhile the weakling scurries off to the gymnasium to develop his muscles and take daily boxing lessons with Jack Dempsey. Why do I mention that old letter? Today we have a new Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones scurrying daily to the gymnasium in the form of Iran and Syria. In 1935, Hitler began rebuilding his military, and the world did nothing. In fact, the United States responded by passing the Neutrality Act, which made it illegal for any American, including the President, to supply weapons to any foreign conflict. Does that sound reminiscent to a recent congressional action in response to Assad gassing his people? With congressional vote against punishing Assad, we've only emboldened him, not unlike the world's non-confrontational stance toward Hitler in the 1930s. Most Americans by nature cannot imagine mass killings of populations. Obama never imagined Assad would kill over 100,000 during the past 2 years, that Assad would resort to chemical weapons. On September 11, 2001, when Bush walked into that schoolroom down in Florida to visit with some little school children, he never imagined that at that moment there were terrorists in control of aircraft that were going to kill thousands of Americans. On December 7th, that morning, FDR could never have imagined that there were flights of Japanese going to destroy the 7th Fleet. In 1935, when FDR signed that Neutrality Act, he never imagined Hitler would gas 6 million Jewish people. Today, with nuclear capability, Israel just over the horizon, Iran and Syria can accomplish in 6 seconds what took Hitler 6 years to do.